The glass shattered before anyone could react. Red wine spread across the table, slipping between plates, seeping into thick, cream-colored papers that were never meant to be seen by anyone outside that room. For a moment, no one spoke. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but heavy. The kind that tells you something has just gone terribly wrong. And standing there, frozen with trembling hands, was the one person no one had noticed all evening. A maid. A woman whose job was to move quietly, to clean without being seen, to exist without being remembered. But in that single moment, she had done something no one else in that house had ever dared to do. She had interrupted control. And more importantly, she had seen something she was never supposed to see. Because as the wine soaked deeper into the paper, words began to appear more clearly. Names, numbers, transactions, details that didn't belong in a home like this, at a table like this, surrounded by men who smiled too carefully and spoke too little. It was supposed to be a simple dinner. A private gathering in one of the most expensive homes in the state, owned by a man who had built his reputation on discipline, precision, and silence. A man people trusted. A man people feared. And yet, in the space of a few seconds, that carefully controlled world began to crack. The man at the head of the table did not shout. He did not panic the way most people would. But his eyes changed. And for someone like him, that was enough to understand everything. Because fear, when it shows itself in someone who is never afraid, means one thing. There is something to lose. Something big. Something worth protecting at any cost. The maid saw it. Not just the documents, not just the reactions, but the shift in the room. The way conversations died instantly. The way one of the guests slowly reached to cover part of the table. The way another man leaned back, watching her too closely, as if trying to decide something in real time. She had spent years working in houses like this, cleaning up after people who never learned her name. And in those years, she had learned one thing very well. You can tell when you are somewhere you shouldn't be. You can feel it before anyone says a word. And in that moment, she felt it stronger than ever before. Because this wasn't just embarrassment. This wasn't just anger over a broken glass or a ruined dinner. This was something else. Something that carried weight. Something that made grown men go quiet. Because what looked like a simple mistake was actually the beginning of something far more dangerous. A secret so serious that someone in that room was already thinking about how to contain it, how to control it, or how to erase it entirely. And the one person who uncovered it was the one nobody had been paying attention to. A maid who had spent her entire life being invisible had suddenly become the most important person in the room, and possibly the most vulnerable. Because when power is threatened, it does not ask questions. It reacts. And that night, inside that quiet, polished house, power had just been threatened in the most unexpected way. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What was hidden inside those documents that could turn a room full of powerful men into statues in a matter of seconds? And why did a man like Richard Halston, a man known for absolute control over every detail of his life, react not with anger, but with something far more telling, something closer to fear, over what should have been nothing more than an unfortunate accident? And how did Naomi Carter, a woman who had built her entire life around being unseen, unheard, and unnoticed, suddenly become the center of attention in a place where people like her were never meant to matter? Because in that moment, as the wine revealed what the ink had tried to hide, the balance of power in that room shifted in a way no one had planned for. And the question was no longer about a broken glass or a ruined dinner, but about what Naomi had seen and what the others believed she now knew. Because by the end of that night, the quiet understanding that passed between those men was not about cleaning up the mess on the table. It was about containing something far more serious, something that had been carefully protected for years, something that could not be allowed to leave that house under any circumstances. And yet the damage had already begun, because Naomi's eyes had lingered just a second too long. Long enough to recognize patterns that didn't belong, numbers that didn't make sense in a normal business context, names that carried weight far beyond the walls of that dining room. And once a truth like that enters someone's mind, it cannot simply be erased. It changes how they are seen, how they are treated, and more importantly, how dangerous they become to the people who have the most to lose. So the real question was no longer what had been spilled, but what had been exposed. and whether what happened next would be an attempt to fix a mistake or to silence it completely. Because in a world where power protects itself at all costs, accidents are rarely treated as accidents, and people who see too much rarely remain part of the story for long. Naomi Carter had spent most of her adult life inside homes that were never hers, moving quietly through spaces built on wealth she would never touch, learning early on that survival in those environments depended on discipline, restraint, and an almost invisible presence that allowed her to exist without ever becoming part of the room. And over the years, she became exceptionally good at it. The kind of worker people trusted not because they knew her, but because they didn't have to think about her at all. And that was exactly how she kept her job, how she paid her bills, and how she kept her life stable in a world that rarely offered second chances. But what most people never realized was that silence does not mean blindness, and invisibility does not mean ignorance. Because Naomi noticed things, small things at first, patterns in behavior, changes in tone, the way people acted when they believed no one important was watching. And she remembered those details with a precision that came from years of quiet observation, storing away fragments of conversations, routines, and inconsistencies that didn't quite add up, not because she was looking for trouble, but because understanding her environment was the only way to stay safe inside it. And that instinct had served her well in every house she had ever worked in, until the night she stepped into Richard Halston's home, a place that operated with a level of control that was immediately noticeable to someone like her. Because Richard Halston was not just wealthy, he was deliberate, the kind of man who built his reputation on order, predictability, and authority, a businessman whose name carried weight in rooms Naomi would never enter, whose success was often described as disciplined and calculated, and whose public image was so clean it almost seemed untouchable. But men like Richard Halston do not reach that level without learning how to control more than just their business. They control environments, conversations, outcomes, and most importantly, people. And inside his home, that control was absolute. Every object placed with intention, every movement expected to follow a standard, every employee aware that mistakes were not part of the system. Because he didn't like mistakes, especially not in his own home. And Naomi understood that the moment she began working there, adjusting quickly, moving carefully, speaking only when necessary, but always observing, always learning, because something about that house felt different from the others, not louder or more chaotic, but quieter in a way that carried weight, as if the silence itself was part of the structure. And on the night of that dinner, that feeling intensified, because the house was prepared not for comfort, but for precision, a private gathering with a select group of guests who arrived not like friends, but like men with purpose, their conversations measured, their attention focused, their presence controlled, and even before a single word was spoken at the table, Naomi could sense that this was not a casual evening, not a simple display of wealth or hospitality, but something far more intentional, something structured beneath the surface, because every movement that night followed a pattern too precise to be ordinary, and every detail suggested that whatever was about to take place had been planned long before the first guest walked through the door. And as Naomi moved quietly through the room, doing exactly what was expected of her, she felt that familiar instinct settle in again, the one that told her when something wasn't right, the one that had kept her safe for years, and it told her, clearly and without hesitation, that this wasn't just another night, this wasn't just another house, and this wasn't just another job, because what was happening inside those walls carried a kind of weight she had never felt before. And by the time she reached that table, by the time the glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the surface, she had already stepped into something far beyond her control, something she would not be able to walk away from so easily, because that night, in Richard Halston's house, what looked like a carefully planned dinner was something much bigger. The guests did not arrive like people attending a dinner. They arrived like men stepping into a situation already understood without words, each one measured in movement, composed in expression, carrying the kind of quiet confidence that comes from power. And Naomi noticed it immediately. The way they greeted Richard Halston with respect but not warmth, the way their eyes moved around the room not to admire it, but to assess it, as if every detail mattered beyond appearance. And as the evening settled, the conversations that followed did not flow the way normal conversations do. They were controlled, deliberate, filled with pauses that felt intentional, sentences that sounded complete but revealed very little, as if meaning was being passed between them without ever being spoken directly. And for someone like Naomi, who had spent years listening without being acknowledged, that kind of communication stood out more than anything else, because it wasn't what they said, it was what they avoided saying. The careful choice of words, the subtle shifts in tone, the moments where one man would stop mid-sentence and another would simply nod, as if the rest didn't need to be spoken aloud. And as she moved around the table, pouring drinks, adjusting plates, maintaining her role, she became increasingly aware of something else, something that didn't match the calm surface of the evening, because despite their composure, these men were watching each other, not casually, but with attention, as if each one was waiting for something, or making sure something went exactly as planned. And Naomi saw it in the smallest details, the way one guest kept his phone within reach at all times, his hand never straying too far from it, the way another would glance toward the center of the table whenever Richard Halston shifted in his seat, and most noticeably, the way a single folder sat slightly apart from everything else, placed not carelessly, but deliberately, as if it held a level of importance that demanded distance from the rest. And Richard Halston checked it more than once, not openly, but in quick, controlled glances that lasted just long enough to confirm its position, its presence, its security, and each time he did, the room seemed to tighten ever so slightly, as if everyone else was aware of it too, but chose not to acknowledge it directly. And then there was the man seated halfway down the table, a guest who didn't speak much, whose posture remained rigid throughout the evening, whose eyes moved more than his words, and Naomi noticed the tension in him, subtle but clear, the kind of unease that doesn't belong in a room full of confident men unless there is a reason for it, unless something about the situation is not entirely under control. And as the dinner continued, that tension didn't fade, it settled deeper, becoming part of the atmosphere, blending into the silence between conversations, into the careful movements, into the controlled environment that Richard Halston had built so precisely. And Naomi, moving quietly through it all, began to understand that this was not simply a gathering of successful individuals sharing a meal. This was something structured, something intentional, something that carried consequences beyond that room. And yet, for all her awareness, for all the details she observed, there was one thing she could not fully understand, one element that stood out above all the others, that folder resting on the table, separate, guarded, acknowledged without being discussed, and she didn't know what was inside it. She couldn't have known, but she understood something just as important, something instinctive, something that had kept her safe for years in environments like this, that whatever was in that folder did not belong in a setting like this, not in a home, not at a dinner table, not surrounded by people who carried themselves with that level of caution and control. And as the evening moved closer to the moment that would change everything, Naomi didn't know what was in that folder, but she knew one thing: it didn't belong at a dinner table. The reaction was immediate, but controlled in a way that made it even more unsettling, because instead of chaos, instead of raised voices or visible panic, Richard Halston stood up slowly, his movements precise, his tone low but firm as he instructed Naomi Carter to step away from the table, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a level of authority that left no room for hesitation. And within seconds, the rhythm of the room shifted again, one of the guests reaching to gather what remained of the documents, another subtly blocking Naomi's line of sight, as if the priority was no longer the spill itself but the containment of what had just been revealed. And Naomi understood the message clearly. She was no longer needed in that room, not because of the mistake, but because of what she had seen. And as she turned to leave, her steps steady despite the tension building around her, she could feel it. The change in how she was being perceived, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, but noticed in a way that carried weight, in a way that carried risk. And even as she exited the dining room, closing the door behind her, the silence inside lingered in her mind, because it wasn't the kind of silence that follows embarrassment, it was the kind that follows exposure, the kind that signals something has gone wrong at a level no one is prepared to address openly. And as she moved through the hallway, away from the controlled environment of that table, her thoughts began to settle into something clearer, sharper, because the fragments she had seen were already forming a pattern, not complete, not fully understood, but enough to recognize that those documents were not ordinary records. The names alone carried weight, the kind of weight tied to influence, to positions of authority, to networks that extended far beyond a single business. And the numbers, structured in ways that didn't align with legitimate transactions, suggested movement of money that had been intentionally concealed, routed through layers designed to avoid attention. And Naomi didn't need formal training to understand what that meant. She had seen enough over the years, heard enough fragments of conversations in places where people assumed no one was listening, to recognize when something crossed the line from business into something else entirely, something illegal, something deliberate, something protected, and more importantly, something that involved people who could not afford to have it exposed. And as that realization settled in, so did something else, something far more immediate, because the moment she stepped into the kitchen, the atmosphere shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for someone like her to notice. The staff quieter than usual, movements more cautious, eyes briefly meeting hers before looking away, as if word had already traveled faster than she had, as if everyone understood that something had happened, but no one was willing to acknowledge it. And when she moved through the house, carrying out tasks that now felt distant and automatic, she began to notice something else, something that confirmed what she already suspected, because conversation stopped when she entered a room, not abruptly, but just enough to signal that her presence now mattered in a way it hadn't before. And at one point, as she stepped outside briefly, needing space, needing air, she caught a glimpse of one of the guests through the glass, watching her, not casually, not absent-mindedly, but with focus, as if assessing her, as if trying to determine something about her that hadn't been relevant just an hour earlier. And later, when she finally left the house for the night, walking toward the quiet street beyond the gates, that feeling didn't leave her. It followed her, settling into something heavier, something more certain, because she could hear it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps behind her that didn't match her own. Steady, measured, maintaining distance but never disappearing, and she didn't turn around immediately. She didn't react the way fear might expect her to, because Naomi Carter had learned long ago that reacting too quickly can reveal more than staying calm. But she knew, without needing confirmation, that she was no longer just someone who worked in that house. She had become part of something else entirely, something that extended beyond those walls, something that had already begun to close around her, because the accident had exposed the truth, but now, it had exposed her too. By the time Naomi Carter reached her apartment that night, the weight of what she had seen had already settled into something she could not ignore, not fear alone, not confusion, but clarity, because the fragments in her mind had begun to align in a way that felt too precise to dismiss. And she understood that staying silent would not make it disappear, it would only place her deeper inside something she did not control. And so, instead of trying to forget, she did what most people in her position would hesitate to do. She acted carefully, deliberately, using the same attention to detail that had defined her entire life. Because before she left Richard Halston's house, in those brief moments after the spill when the room was focused on containment rather than observation, she had done something small but critical, something no one noticed. She had taken out her phone under the pretense of cleaning, angling it just enough to capture fragments of what lay on that table. Not everything, not perfectly, but enough to preserve what her memory alone could not prove. And now, sitting in the quiet of her own space, she reviewed it, frame by frame, the blurred edges of ink revealing patterns that became clearer the longer she looked, names she recognized from news headlines, numbers structured in ways that suggested movement designed to avoid detection, and connections that pointed not to isolated wrongdoing, but to something organized, something sustained over time. And it was what followed in the weeks after that night did not happen all at once, and it did not happen publicly at first, because investigations like this move quietly before they move visibly. But behind closed doors, the structure that had protected Richard Halston for years began to weaken, piece by piece, as authorities connected information that had once seemed unrelated, tracing transactions, identifying patterns, linking names that had appeared separately but now formed a network too clear to ignore. And at the center of it all was the evidence that had come from a moment no one had planned for, a moment that had turned something hidden into something undeniable. And as that process unfolded, the control Richard Halston had maintained for so long began to slip, not dramatically at first, but in subtle ways that signaled a shift. Meetings canceled, communications reduced, attention redirected, and then, eventually, the silence broke, because once the investigation reached a point where it could no longer remain contained, the public narrative began to change, reports surfaced, questions were raised, and the image of a disciplined, untouchable businessman started to fracture under the weight of what had been uncovered. And for the first time, the power that had once protected him became the very thing that drew attention to him. Because the higher the position, the greater the fall when the truth is revealed. And as more details emerged, it became clear that what had taken place over the years was not isolated, not accidental, but deliberate, structured, and sustained in a way that required cooperation from multiple individuals who had all believed it would remain hidden, and yet it didn't, because one moment had changed the direction of everything. One unexpected disruption had exposed what careful planning had tried to conceal, and as the consequences unfolded, as reputations collapsed and positions shifted, as those once in control found themselves answering questions instead of directing them, Naomi Carter remained where she had always been, outside the spotlight, away from recognition. Her role never fully understood by those watching from a distance, but essential in a way that could not be denied, because without that moment, without her presence, without the attention to detail that allowed her to see what others overlooked, the truth might have remained buried indefinitely. And in the end, what brought everything into the open was not power, not influence, not authority, but something far simpler and far more unexpected: a single moment, a single mistake, a single person who was never supposed to see anything, and yet saw everything. Because sometimes the truth does not come from those who control the room. It comes from those who are never meant to be part of it. It comes from the people no one notices. What do you think really happened that night inside Richard Halston's house? Was it truly just a moment of human error, a simple slip that changed everything? Or was it something deeper, something that felt almost inevitable given everything Naomi Carter had already begun to notice before that glass ever left her hand? Because sometimes what looks like an accident carries a weight that feels too precise to ignore. And if you found yourself in her position, standing in that room, seeing what she saw, understanding what it meant in that exact moment, would you have walked away and stayed silent? Or would you have taken the same risk knowing exactly what kind of people you were up against? Let us know in the comments below, because your perspective matters more than you think, and conversations like this often reveal just how differently people respond when placed in situations where the truth comes with consequences. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you think twice about how power operates behind closed doors, then there is more waiting for you, because stories like this are not as rare as they seem, and the next one might challenge everything you believe even further. So don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that prove truth is often stranger than fiction.